I'm grateful to be back on campus at UC Riverside, and I'm very proud to be part of this conference, which has now become an annual event. I think that you just had an extraordinarily well-done presentation by Courtney Smith from the Energy Commission. It gave you a sense of the lay of the land. Things are changing rapidly in California. We are adapting to new realities, some of which are exogenous variables, as we might say, like the wildfires. I think it's important to emphasize, despite how much rain we've gotten, and we're hopeful that that smooths things out a bit, the last two summers and falls have been unprecedented in the damage and the scope of harm that has been caused. And there's been a lot of talk about utilities and liability and lawsuits and litigation, but the fact is the losses that we have sustained from the wildfires, not just the utilities, but their customers and the insurance companies, is unprecedented. And we're going to have to do a lot. This is what I would call an emergency climate adaptation scenario. We've always talked about climate adaptation, but now we see emergency conditions that are having to be dealt with. And the heat storms, along with the flooding. I mean, California has always been a place of floods, fires, earthquakes, and drought. This is our fate. But what we are seeing now is a confluence of circumstance and changes that is shaking everything up. Okay, one of the things that Courtney talked about was the disaggregation of the load between a bunch of different load-serving entities. Instead of the three major utilities plus the munis, we're now seeing new entrants serving load, whose I would characterize as well-meaning, enthusiastic, but it's not clear that they're going to add value to what we're trying to do. So what we're going to talk about today a little bit is where things stand vis-a-vis the solar industry. In your packet and on the counter is a very excellent paper that Ron Loveridge and Alfredo and Fred have put together about the potential opportunities in the Inland Empire. As you heard in the previous speaker, a lot of the task is now shifting from deploying technologies to integrating technologies. Okay, we're not simply trying to throw kilowatt hours onto the grid anymore. We've done that. We've demonstrated that we can produce large amounts of renewables at scale. We can get them permitted mostly, despite California's reputation for being a difficult place to permit. We were successful in getting a lot of projects built interconnected, but now we're dealing with the consequences of all of that success because we have transformed the grid and created new circumstances that as we move forward, we're going to have to master and manage. So we have a very distinguished panel today that has different vantage points from which to share with you. So we're going to first hear from Dara Young. She is the Senior Manager for Permit and Inspections with Sunrun. She's at the ground level of trying to put projects together at the local level, and so we're going to first hear from her, and then we're going to hear from Russell Garwacki from Southern California Edison, who's the Manager of Customer Pricing, and he can tell you about what's coming with regard to time of use. Pricing is very different circumstances now in terms of when we want to encourage people to use and not use electricity. One of the most important parts of our strategy going forward is demand response and trying to match when the demand and the load occurs to when we have the most renewable generation. And so that means, and it's different than it was. The afternoon peak is now the evening peak. And so instead of turning everything off in the afternoon, we're maybe going to start turning things on to charge our vehicles and run our water heaters and so forth. And then lastly, we have Scott Murdishaw, who has been one of the key leaders at the Public Utilities Commission, and before that at Lawrence Livermore Lab, Lawrence Berkeley Lab. So he's a policy innovator and has been involved with most of the incentive and policy programs at the PUC. He's now working as a regulatory consultant to the California Solar and Storage Organization. So we've got the utility perspective, the installer and distributor perspective, and the market perspective. So together, hopefully, we'll be able to shine some light and share some of our thoughts and then have some time for questions. So, Derry, you want to get us started?
So I've been in the space, in the industry for 10 years, and in permitting and inspections and operations. And so I've seen sort of industry grow, right, in when Steve Strong showed that graph of solar exploding, right, like right as it was growing. So seen a lot of changes over the past 10 years. But Sunrun, if you don't know, is a mission-driven organization. Our goal is to create a planet run by the sun. And this is a photo of actual Sunrun installs in Stevenson Ranch up in the high desert. So we want to see more communities like this, and Sunrun is very committed to that. An overview of Sunrun: we are the largest residential provider of solar and storage and energy services in the country, and we've deployed over 1.5 gigawatts of residential solar over the past 10 years. We were a pioneer of solar as a service 10 years ago. That's, again, sort of helped make solar affordable and bring that trend of the growing solar installs in residential market. Today we have over 230,000 customers nationwide, and we're in over 23 states. California is definitely our busiest state. Our headquarters is in San Francisco, and we actually have an office here in Riverside County, and our branch manager is here today. So for all of you students in here, we're always looking for bright minds, so I'll throw that out there. So I'll jump right into solar, the challenges, the state of solar that we see today. So as John mentioned, I am very much on the ground in the day-to-day of residential solar and how do we get these projects approved and to install. California has done a lot of policy work and is at the forefront of laws. I think it was 2 years ago, there was a bill called AB 2188 for expedited permitting. As, again, Stephen Strong mentioned earlier, there was a project that took 2.5 years to permit and 2.5 months to build. And the goal of that was to try to reduce those timelines as we extend out the timeline for residential solar projects, it leads to 5 to 10% cancellation rate. And today, the cost of permitting of solar at residential side is about $1 a watt. And for comparison, the cost of installing a residential solar project is about $2.70. So it definitely takes up a large chunk of where the cost for solar and making it affordable for everyone. Russell had, just before we came on stage, talked about in other countries, Australia and Germany as an example, soft costs are way lower because of a different regular landscape for permitting. There's basically no permitting there, and solar just goes up, so gets installed. So our goal is to reduce soft costs by more than $1 a watt over the next 5 years. If you also look at sort of the graph of how the cost of solar has come down, the equipment, material, the technology costs we've been able to innovate, and the industry has done a lot there to reduce those hard costs, but we're still working on the soft costs. So that is a major challenge to the industry today. And for not just San Bernardino and Riverside counties, but what can we do here to reduce the barriers in developing a sustainable solar and energy supply chain in the region is to look at the varied permitting and inspection processes, even among neighboring jurisdictions. So again, not just limited to here, but as an example, Riverside County has a very different permitting process than their next door neighbors in San Bernardino. And I don't know about you guys, but when I first joined the solar industry and came out of college, went into permitting, they're like, here, you go get a permit. You have to physically drive to the permit office, right? And then you sit and wait in line, and then you submit your plan set, and then you go home or go back to work, not home. Don't skip work, right? And then 2 weeks later, they call you, and then you physically drive, and you wait in line, and then you go pick up the permit. And to me, I was like mind blown coming out of college, where you realize everything's not rainbows and unicorns and happy, and laws just automatically work like that, right? So that's sort of what we see today still. The vast majority of jurisdictions require that on-the-ground, person-to-person meeting, submittals in person, that long wait time. There's been a lot of development over the past 2 years, especially with the laws in California for expedited permitting, and we're seeing more jurisdiction move online. City of LA was a big jurisdiction to sort of kick off the online permitting process. Today, you can go on their online portal, type in, put in your system information. The back end, they do an automatic check that your electrical calculations work, and you're issued a permit. So that's where we want to go in the future. So those varied, and that's where a lot of the soft cost comes from, right? The physical time that we have to spend, and then all the differences that each jurisdiction requires. So at Sunrun, and I'm sure a lot of our solar contractors have a database. We have a database of 2,500 plus jurisdictions where you try to keep track of what every single jurisdiction requires, so that we can, when we submit a plan set, we can get it right the first time and get a permit quickly. So that is all a lot of maintenance, a lot of manpower to maintain. So the other point there is permit fees. California is also on the forefront of this. There is a law that limits permit fees for solar to $450, and that amount came out of a study. I think it was by the Sierra Club, and a recommendation of we should not be, that is the recovery cost for solar, right? For permitting and inspections, what the jurisdiction typically has to basically expend to process these permits. Today we see a lot of jurisdictions also trying to get around that law, where we have to pull several permits for one project, right? And each permit can be $450. But that is, I won't name any names, right? And it's not just California, not this region. But that is a barrier as well. So where do we want to be in the future? There is a campaign going on called the Solar App Campaign, right? We're partnering with NREL and a lot of industry folks and CALSA, and the goal is to create a single national online permitting portal for the jurisdictions to automate the solar and storage permitting and inspection process. So we understand that it's not just on the jurisdictions. We can't just say, hey, you guys need to get your act together, right? There's tons of challenges. They need to do their due diligence. So the industry is hoping to support and create and help by creating this tool. So the idea is to have a flexible, open source portal for all contractors to use and the jurisdictions to use at no cost. And it supports online payments. It does, again, we're using City of LA as a model where you can permit and they do a check for you. It's all integrated in their system, so there's no safety concerns. And standardize all of that and make it easy for jurisdictions as well to make sure that, hey, this is good, right? We're not just having somebody come in and say, I want to build solar and piece it all together, right? That all the checks are still there. So that's where we hope to be in the next few years. And some of these are the policies that are involved in making the solar process and permitting process easier. Some other examples are City of Las Vegas out in Nevada. They have an instant permit. They actually don't do any checks. You go in online, at the front end. I apologize, I won't be clear. On the front end for your permitting. You are issued a permit online and you go install, and at the back end, they inspect it, everything's good, move on. So this shouldn't be unique to solar. If you look at today, HVAC, roofs, main panel upgrades, all of those are common, one-stop permitting, easy permitting, and that's where we want to get solar as well. So it's not unprecedented, right? We're not trying to do something that hasn't been tested before, but there is a long way to go. It's new technologies. We need to get everyone on the comfortable. And the other benefit of this is it places the liability firmly on the installer, right? This is the installer's job to do it right the first time. If they don't do it right, or we don't do it right, we got to go fix it. So having the permit process easy up front should not be a concern, and we've seen it done in places like Australia and Germany, as an example. And another part of it is inspections. And also for some of you, if you're not familiar with the inspection process, similar to the permitting process, we drive out on site, right? We're given a window, maybe between 2 hours or 4 hours of when the inspector might show up, and we're waiting there for the inspector to show up. And that's half your day right there to do usually a 10-minute check of what your solar install is. So another big part of it is how do we solve for that? How do we get to an online inspection, a photo review, an audit, right? There's lots of opportunity with the technologies, with cell phone and video conferencing and things like that. How do we get there? So that is, for me, very real what we see today. Lots of good policy in place. California is at the forefront of all of that. We still have some work to do in getting everyone on the same page and realizing those at the ground level.
Thank you, Dara, and that's a brilliant illustration of how, despite the fact that the technology availability, the commercialization, and the economics are all good. We won that argument, okay? Now the question is, can our institutions adapt to the new realities that we are putting on the grid? And this is the ground level at the permitting. You gave some very good examples. I've heard this number about the soft cost being in a very high percentage. So we haven't won entirely until we can squeeze out some of those soft costs and then be able to take further advantage of the technology improvements that we have. I also think that as we move towards more standardized applications where you're not going to see rooftop solar in the future probably without storage, then we get experience how those systems get packaged. And then I think it's also part of the educational process for the permit agencies. And this is something where I think Energy Commission does a lot of good work to, we've got to get training for these. You've got inspectors want to do their job, but they got to know what they're looking for, and they got to know easier ways to do it. So now we're going to turn to Southern California Edison and Russell's experience in pricing, because now we're going to try to see how can we make the load that we are experiencing match better with the generation profiles that we're now seeing, and that's what Russell's in the process of doing. So, Russell.
I could talk about a lot of these different issues in terms of decarbonizing the electric sector and transportation and the electrification of buildings. All of those would take up way more time than I've got right now. I'm going to focus in on the electric sector, but obviously there's overlap and interplay between all three of these. To the extent that we want to decarbonize the electric sector, obviously key, we're well on our way. We've got laws in place that we are going to get there. That much is clear. The next trick of it is to go ahead and figure out how to take the next steps concurrently, which is electrifying the transportation, and then the heavier pull is going to be buildings. But for now, let's go ahead and move towards electricity. You heard earlier that we've got the Renewable Portfolio Standard, the RPS, progressively going up to the point where SB 100 passed last year, getting us to 60%, or increasing that RPS from 50 to 60% by 2030. Most importantly, getting us or establishing a target of 100% by 2045. We're on our way there. Again, we're ahead of our 2020 schedule from 2018, again, a tick over 33, as we heard earlier in the day. The focus of my discussion is going to be on some of the other overlaps, because we've got competing principles as the electric utility. It's not strictly only about decarbonizing the grid, all right? We've got other rate design principles. Our rates have to be based on cost of service, they have to be affordable, they have to incentivize conservation, energy efficiency, et cetera. Customers have to understand them, but more importantly, recently, we have to make sure that we provide safe, reliable, clean power, okay? With the focus on the wildfires, there's going to be undue pressure on the affordability aspects of that, and that's what I'll be focusing a lot on in the following slides. Distributed generation, again, some landmark legislation a few years ago that talked about establishing some contracts that equate the costs and the benefits, again, to make sure that the mature industry that we see for solar today carries through and is not necessarily requiring subsidies that were required through the RPS standards and others to further that solar industry. As we heard earlier, solar and storage paired with storage is cost competitive. So that is the future. We are there already. Some distributed generation growth over time. We see, obviously, it's ratcheting up like crazy. This just happens to be Southern California Edison's share, about 40% of the share of California, and you can see that we've got close to about 2,400 megawatts. This is data that's online. If you want to catch any of these subsets, I've got some sourcing down there. Catch me later and I'll forward you the presentation. You can look some of these cool sites up yourself. And what's also important is that we've got over 3,700 megawatts of central station power that's come online by 2018 as well. So it's very much a blend of both distributed solar and central station power. Virtually all of the central station power is PV. There's a spattering of some thermal, but the vast majority of SCE's contracts are PV. But this gives you a sense of the growth over time, and obviously it's booming. The state of solar is very good in California. The impacts, it's so good, and you heard about it. Folks have heard the duck curve. I didn't have a presentation on the duck curve. I think I had a duck slide in there last year. Show of hands, do I need to go into what the duck curve is? How many people know it? Yes, thank you, good, quack. There's my nod to the duck curve, but very real implications of that. Tomorrow, SCE is changing its time of use rates, its basic time of use rates, for the first time ever. I'm older than dirt. I started SCE in 1983. Show of hands. Who was born after 1983? God. I got in trouble with HR by asking that of one of my employees because it was just a mind screw for me. But anyway, I digress. Anyway, these are the new TOU rates. It's no longer my parents give your appliance the afternoon off of noon to 6. All right, with the abundance of solar energy in the middle of the day, that nice good bell generation curve, that peak cost period is during the ramp down periods of solar generation. We've got to ramp up the gen of gas fired at this point in time. That peak costing period is now 4 to 9 during all hours of the day. And so we are changing that starting tomorrow, again, for the first time ever in my career. And like I said, I've been around forever. And so what's happening now is that the new TOU rate structures, which used to be a bit more favorable to standalone solar gen, are now shifted. The standalone solar projects economics have degraded somewhat because now the peak period pricing is 4 to 9. Well, once one window closes, a door opens, or vice versa. But the fact of the matter is, while the standalone solar projects are a little bit less economical, what it does do is it improves the economics for paired storage projects. All right, so go ahead and use that energy in the middle of the day. I can talk about electric transportation in terms of charging your vehicles during the course of a day at buildings and worry about range anxiety, but the fact of the matter is that the pricing periods are changing and we're starting tomorrow. PG&E and San Diego Gas and Electric, they're also on board with this, slightly different time of use periods depending on our specific utility cost profiles, but it's a statewide phenomenon. It's not only statewide because APS is going there, Arizona, and also Nevada are starting to see these implications as well as solar becomes more prevalent, especially in the Southwest. But when we start talking about the issue of increased solar, and we know we're going to decarbonize, and we know we're going to have both a mix or a combination of behind the meter and in front of the meter solar technologies, the question becomes one of cost. All right, what's least cost? Does it matter to us if you displace a megawatt hour of natural gas fired with PV that's centered above or below the meter? Well, not in terms of generation. There'll be some losses and things of that nature, but by and large, what we ought to be doing is going for the least cost resource, least cost best fit. And so one of the things that's coming up in one of the CPUC's integrated resource planning program is to stack all these different types of scenario sources against each other. And what we see here is essentially you see a default amount of GHG production based on our generation profile, and this is a couple years old. But what you see is moving from left to right in big blocks, moving down, I think this is about 62 million metric tons of GHG production, reducing that to 42 million metric tons, reducing it further to 30 million metric tons, and you see the incremental amounts of generation and generation fuel source that are optimized to provide that level of carbon in the industry or in the electric generation sector. All right? But what you also see, as you reduce the amount of carbon, you have to have more and more solar, you have to have more and more clean resources come into play. What's important to see here is, yes, as you decarbonize, there is some cost. What's important to see on the bottom part of these things is when you start talking about low behind the meter PV, the reference case, which the reference case is obviously the difference is zero from itself, and then you have high behind the meter PV cases, to the extent that you have economies of scale between central station facilities and behind the meter station facilities, what you have is the higher behind the meter case, which is here, the high behind the meter case, ends up costing more due to the economies of scale. And the difference between the high and the low behind the meter cases are about $1 billion under this reference case of what was adopted in this particular proceeding to hit this target of GHG reduction. So again, when we have a system, we have an application currently in place to deal with wildfires and grid resiliency that is an application before the Public Utilities Commission that's over $500 million. All right? That's not chump change. Somebody has to pay for that. Somebody will pay for that because obviously safe, reliable power is paramount to our vitality. And so the question becomes one of, if I can get roughly the same type of solar and decarbonization at a bargain price, why wouldn't I? Because I've got all kinds of other issues, all kinds of other priorities to spend money on. Alternative supply storage costs, again, there's economies of scale when it comes to whether, and these are some snapshots of a Lazard study, which seems to be one of the industry standards in terms of cost price points, but you can see that there's economies of scale at utility scale PV and storage versus residential, which is down here. I happen to highlight it, and then commercial industrial elements here as well. The key, that I would point out, and one thing I'd want to point out is that utility scale doesn't mean utility owned. This is not necessarily Edison putting out there and saying, well, we want to have the utility scale out here because we want to be able to increase our profit lines. Our energy procurement is passed through at cost to our customers. So this is really a matter of what's most economical for our customers, and that's our motivation here. All right? So there's economies of scale. I won't get into that. The key there is, you saw it earlier, these economies of scale are very static in time. You saw with the solar technology dropping down like a stone over the last 10 years. You're going to see it with the battery technology as well. So all of these things are going to have interrelationships, most notably in the electric transportation sector coming on board as well. The affordability piece, when we start talking about net energy metering, that is a question of cost shifts or subsidies. We go out to the marketplace and we can procure solar power in the marketplace at a competitively bid price of $0.05 per kilowatt hour, more or less, probably a little less. With storage a little bit more. But the point is that this is a mature industry at this point in time. The net energy metering rate structures that we have in place today pay the distributed solar roughly 20 cents per kilowatt hour. So I could go shop at Nordstrom's and pay 20 cents a kilowatt hour, or I can go down and bid it out and go to Walmart for a nickel a kilowatt hour. And if you're paying the bill for largely a homogeneous product, what should you buy? Well, we have an obligation to buy lower cost price. We have a fiduciary responsibility to our customers, and so we're looking to buy basically a homogeneous product for a lower price, and that's what I'd be advocating for. This particular slide shows the low income pricing. We have very much a have and have not society in California. It's getting to that level very, very closely. California has the highest poverty rates in the nation, all right? So we have about 1.2 million customers on our low income rate, and they get about $375 million a year in direct rate subsidies. The subsidies that are provided today for about 300,000 residential customers via the net energy metering program exceed that. And these are to wealthier customers that have installed rooftop solar. Granted, those policies are in place to go ahead and jumpstart that industry, and it has jumpstarted it very well. But those things need to change if we're talking about affordability concerns for millions of other customers that are on the other end of that spectrum. The other elements in terms of the rate design geek, and I'll start jumping into it a bit more, and that is the issue of offsetting distribution costs, okay? The distribution grid. When we start talking about PV and the rest of it, you know, more often than not, I mean, most of the people who are zero net energy are not zero net costs. They are not generally detached from the grid. They still need grid backup in the middle of the night, snowy snowstorms, rain, whatever. By and large, the grid acts as a virtual battery for these things and are costs that need to be paid because of system reliability concerns. Well, there are two different types of distribution costs. There are the grid costs to facilitate that interconnection into the grid. Then there are the peak capacity costs that are large, you know, somewhat avoidable when we start talking about solar. We start talking about distributed energy resources. The fact is that when we start offsetting some of the peak capacity costs, we can strategically deploy some of these distributed energy resources, whether it's solar, and more importantly, solar plus battery that can be dispatched at a moment's notice with some real good smart algorithms, and some of them are in back, which drove my vote, number 3. Real good smart students involved with dispatching these types of things to take advantage of the rate structures in place to try and avoid those costs. And that's where that's the next step. The relevance of location, like I said, not all circuits have this type of capacity available to them. It's a real good trick to try and overlay what the overlay is between distributed energy resources and where distribution capacity needs exist. And that's the subject of some ongoing work that we're going on right now with some different proceedings, at least a couple different proceedings ongoing, and there's a workshop in the next couple days up next week to start talking about some of these ideas and how to get them deployed, not only on the distribution side, but also to try and take advantage of some paired deployments, both in terms of the retail space, but also the wholesale space. I know Scott will probably talk a little bit about that next. But that's really important when we start talking about how do we extract all the value. It isn't all about peak load management. There's also some slivers of costs, peak costs, that can be avoided as well. And that's what some of the more interesting next step work is going to be. Conclusions. Solar PV generation is continue to be an integral part. That's so obvious, especially in this room. That's preaching to the choir. I don't have to go any further on that. The DG compensation reform, it's important that we don't get holistically caught up in this, because there are a lot of other rate issues that are going forward in terms of electric transportation and building electrification as well. So there's a lot of prongs to this for this strategy to come forward with. Energy storage set to become a larger part of long-term storage. Again, I think you've heard that from everybody who's spoken so far. Again, what I would leave you with is that in this time of competing resources and competing objectives, there's a billion-dollar question. I pointed it out on a slide about 5 slides ago, how best to affordably achieve California's GHG and clean climate objectives. And that's what I'll leave you with and turn it over.
Thank you, Russell, for giving us some real important insights into the changing landscape and the changing value proposition for solar storage and other pieces. I think emphasizing the best fit aspect is one part of the equation that we've kind of missed up to now. And we're going to have to do a better job of that. Now we're going to have Scott Murdishaw, who will, I think, have some insights into how the scenarios that Russell laid out in terms of the changed landscape, what that means for the market, and what are the new opportunities for continuing to move solar and storage into the mainstream, even as circumstances, prices, and incentives change. So, Scott.
I'd like to thank the university, too, for inviting our association to participate in the event here today. This is my first time at this event, and hearing Dara and Russ go before me, there's a lot to discuss because solar and increasingly solar plus storage touch on so many aspects of utility operations and costs and the interactions with customers. We're just now beginning to really scratch the surface of how we use these very flexible resources to provide additional value streams to the grid. I'll talk a little bit about that. I tend to think of adding storage to solar means that that you basically are using this Swiss Army knife-like tool that can manage energy in so many different ways over so many different time frames, providing values at the sub-second level over short durations, at very tight levels of granular spatial specificity to the wholesale market. And so in my talk, I'm going to try to put it in the context of 6 key drivers for primarily the behind-the-meter solar and storage market. And note that I say storage almost every time I say solar, because increasingly we see these two resources being joined at the hip. Our association, just as an example, was the California Solar Energy Industries Association for 40 years, going back to the mid-70s, when it primarily represented solar thermal installers. We now have approximately 500 members still doing some solar thermal, but also solar PV, specialized financiers, insurance, product manufacturers and developers, and increasingly we have a lot of members who are very active in the storage space across the value chain. So just in the last year, we changed our name to the Solar and Storage Association, recognizing the fact that solar is increasingly dependent on storage. So just as a general framework, you've got 6 key drivers, other than just the cost of the technologies themselves, that will drive the market for any particular customer-sided resource in any jurisdiction. And so those are, what are the rates that customers are being charged? Is there enough of a savings that solar and storage can provide? What is the net energy metering compensation structure built around those rates? Do you get full retail value for any energy that you deliver to the grid? Or under the current laws in California, do you get some reduction from the full retail value? The NEM, what's called the NEM 2.0, the successor to the NEM structure that we had in place for decades in California. You now get less value for the power you deliver to the grid. Then there are the any incentive programs. California had a solar incentive program for 10 years. That was used up. You no longer receive any particular incentive from the state for solar, but there is an active incentive program for storage. And then what are any additional revenue opportunities that customers get? Can you participate in programs like demand response or deliver energy and capacity directly to a wholesale market? To some extent, mandates, it's rare to have mandates for solar and storage, but as many of you know, just this year, CALSA was an instrumental player in convincing the California Energy Commission to approve, as part of its Title 24 building codes updates, to require storage for most solar family and small residential structures. So I'll put into context in a graph here in a minute the impact that would have on the total market. And then you have interconnection and permitting. Those 6 factors will drive the market. They'll either serve as facilitators and enablers or impediments to the market. And so you heard from Russ about rates and a little bit about NEM. You heard from Dara about permitting and inspections. I'll try to fill in most of the gaps. So between the 3 of us, we'll hit 5 out of 6 of these key points. So here are some of the threats and opportunities for behind-the-meter solar. That's BTM. It's an acronym I use a lot. Um, So four key things for solar specifically. One, the investment tax credit, which for many years has provided a 30% tax credit on the value of any installed solar or storage when it's paired with solar, has been a major driver of the market all over the United States. That begins to expire in exactly 10 months. So beginning next year, that 30% credit will drop to 26%. 2021, it'll drop to 22%. And then in 2022, it actually vanishes entirely for homeowners, 0%. So this cliff, we just hit a cliff in 2022. And there's a standing 10% investment tax credit that applies for businesses for virtually any sort of capital. So that doesn't expire, but it's still a big drop to go from 22 to 10. So huge change over the next 3 years that we know. Net energy metering rules are set to be reopened for further consideration sometime this year. When the Public Utilities Commission passed the NEM 2.0, the successor tariff decision in 2016, it was a pretty modest reform, basically eliminating the value of exports from your solar system to the grid by 2 or 3 cents per kilowatt hour. But they said in 2019, we will completely reopen this entire framework for further consideration. Anything could happen. The two of those alone, potentially over the next 2 to 3 years, represent literally a mortal threat to the behind-the-meter solar industry. That is no exaggeration. If the commission were to move aggressively on net energy metering at the same time the ITC expires, there will be virtually no solar industry in California. So the solar mandate for new homes, we estimate that'll be about 250 to 300 megawatts per year. So that's not bad. And that's a nice, steady source of demand. It's not as much as some people may think because the Energy Commission only requires a relatively small solar system on new homes, in part because they'll be so efficient. There'll be less load to offset. The Energy Commission also, I think, wisely did provide some extra credit, in a sense, for builders who pair that solar with storage so that the solar energy can be used when it provides more value later in the day. Overall, as you've heard me reference a few times here, solar is becoming increasingly dependent on storage. The costs of solar have fallen dramatically in the last 15 years. Utilities are procuring utility scale at 3 cents or even less per kilowatt hour, but storage is just on the early stages of hitting that declining cost curve and really scaling up and hitting those same economies of scale. So to the extent solar depends on storage as time of use rates change, as the ITC expires and so on, we really need storage to mature rapidly so that we're not left with this valley of death between the time that solar on its own loses value and storage catches up. So this is just a chart to show some trends in behind-the-meter solar and storage. And just to be clear up front, these are incremental installations per year. So this isn't a cumulative chart. Russ showed you a cumulative graph for SCE. This is statewide. What that cumulative graph doesn't show you, unless you really look closely at the blue bars that were on top, which showed the new installs per year, is that the market for solar has kind of flatlined since the commission made that decision in 2016. So there was a lot of concern when solar was growing this fast. What do we do about the cost shift? This is running away from us. This is gonna have huge impacts on the bills of other customers. But since 2016, basically installations of solar have been almost level. And then the other thing that happened as a result of that decision, it requires residential customers who install solar to be on TOU rates. So not only was the commission removing some of the value, skimming off a couple of cents from the value of the solar right off the top, they said, well, from here on, you've got to be on a TOU rate. By the way, those TOU rates are changing, and the peaks are going to be after your solar is producing any power. So when your solar is actually generating solar energy, it's going to be worth a lot less than it was before. I'll give you a really concrete example. And I was surprised that Russ didn't talk about this to give you a sort of a clearer, concrete example of how this is affecting the market in Edison territory. the TOU rates that change tomorrow. Currently, you've got peaks that range from 12 to 6 or 2 to 8. And those rates are 20 plus cents per kilowatt hour. Starting tomorrow, any new customer installing solar who doesn't get grandfathered will be on a TOU rate that provides 9 cents of value during key daylight hours for 8 months of the year, for every month but June through September. So 8 months of the year, your solar is competing against 9 cents. If you export any power during that time, you're taking off another 2 or 3 cents. You're basically getting about 5 cents of value from your solar. That would also significantly impact those cost-shifting graphs that Russ showed you, because those are all premised on old NEM and old TOU rates. With the new NEM and the updated TOU rates, that cost shift will be significantly lower than what they've estimated. It also fails to take into account the savings that aren't credited to behind-the-meter solar. So just a couple of examples there. The industry has argued for a long time, distributed solar will help reduce costs like the need for new transmission lines, the need for new distribution upgrades, but we didn't have evidence of it for years. Then 2 or 3 years ago, PG&E announced that they were canceling $192 million worth of transmission and sub-transmission level upgrades, and they attributed that, PG&E attributed that largely to rooftop solar. Then last year, CAISO put out a transmission planning document that said, we're canceling $2.6 billion of previously approved transmission lines in the state of California. We can't tell you exactly why, but it's basically because of rooftop solar and to some extent energy efficiency that we didn't have in our earlier forecasts. So now we know that we are saving ratepayers money through these avoided investments. It's just been difficult to quantify. So I'll talk a little bit about the incentive program for storage. The key program is called SGIP, Self-Generation Incentive Program. Starting in 2017, the budget for that program was doubled. The current incentive budget is about $150 million per year. And the PUC decision from around 2016 reserved about 80% of that for storage. So you saw on that previous chart, that's when storage starts to take off. We get these much bigger budgets. The PUC decides to make SGIP much more about storage and less about older technologies like combined heat and power. It has 5 declining incentive steps. It started at 50 cents per watt hour down to 25 cents per watt hour of capacity. So $250 per kilowatt hour of capacity. The program got off to a good start. It stalled out in many of the territories. There have been a lot of complaints about the incentive application process. Interconnection has been a nightmare in some jurisdictions. It's taking months to years to get permits approved. And to some extent, that is understandable. This is a new technology for many of these jurisdictions. They are concerned about safety, but it is literally killing the progress of the industry. It has come to an almost complete halt after a big surge a couple of years ago. Now that program was set to expire this year. CALSA and some of our allies went to the legislature last year and asked for an extension of that program. Senate Bill 700, authored by Scott Wiener from San Francisco, who we are deeply indebted to, managed to get that bill passed. So we get another 5 years to help the storage industry mature while these other threats to the solar industry are possibly decreasing the value of standalone solar. There are some key questions about implementation. The legislature passes a bill, it's permissive. It allows the PUC to approve budgets up to $750 million a year, but it doesn't require them to. And so far to date, the PUC has issued no document whatsoever describing how they intend to implement it. So major questions: how much money will the PUC authorize? How much of that will be dedicated to storage? And how might those incentive steps be restructured? How many cents per watt hour and how big are each steps? But even with some fairly conservative assumptions, we think that this program could incentivize up to 2,000, maybe even 2,500 megawatts of storage over the next several years. All right, so that's the incentives that help drive storage. Other revenue streams that we're trying to help develop are revenues for grid services. So net energy metering is nice. It helped the solar industry get off the ground, but it's a pretty blunt instrument. It just says, hey, you've got some solar, you pump it out on the grid, we'll just compensate you at the retail price or some slight reduction of the retail price or variant of the retail price. What we're trying to get to is how do we use these assets to really deliver real quantifiable value in specific locations. So one program is the local resource adequacy. This is where the ISO determines that there may be a shortfall in a specific area that doesn't have enough transmission. They say we either need to build a new transmission line or the PUC needs to go out and ensure that there's enough generation capacity locally. And there have been some successes with companies like Advanced Microgrid Services and Swell and Tesla getting some contracts to provide that capacity from behind-the-meter resources to say, if you need us during these certain hours in these locations, we will be there. We will provide that power to the grid and make sure that power is reliable in this area. So that's at the generation level. That's a well-established program for generation services. It was just revising the rules enough to allow these behind-the-meter resources to compete alongside in front-of-the-meter resources. Distribution services is the whole, this is the Wild West. We are on the cutting edge of figuring out how to do this. So in part, it involved opening up the distribution planning process of the utilities to figure out where do they need to make upgrades, where do they need to expand substations or upgrade distribution lines. This process that the PUC has begun will allow distributed resources to say, we can guarantee that we will put the resources in those exact areas. We will make ourselves available due to penalties for non-performance. You can rely on us. We just have to figure out the prices and the processes. You tell us the need that you have and we'll be there. Now, the first round of that was just kicked off in December. The utilities submitted their first ever advice letters to the commission seeking approval. It was about 30 megawatts. It was not a lot. It was kind of disappointing. But there are some real technical challenges to work out. In the workshop that Russ mentioned earlier at the PUC Monday and Tuesday is how do we use basically something a little bit more like a feed-in tariff approach where you have a set price. The utility says, in this area where we would otherwise have to upgrade the substation to serve additional load, we will offer a price per kilowatt, and companies like Sunrun can then come in and take advantage of that price. That provides an extra incentive, an extra revenue stream to them, and an incentive to really build in very specific areas to meet that need, that local need. There are some big barriers to the participation of behind-the-meter resources that want to provide those services to the grid. Some of the utilities' rules have said if you participate in net energy metering or SCHIP, then you can't participate in these programs. We think that that's kind of silly because NIM and SCHIP just provide these undifferentiated incentives. We're saying on top of that, let's make sure that those resources are used in a more effective manner. We're on board with making sure that our resources are providing real grid value. There's also no workable solution yet for allowing exported energy to participate from behind the meter. The ISO has these demand response programs where they say if you agree to curtail your load during these certain times, we can recognize that as a reliable resource and counting towards the megawatt needs in this area. But the CAISO doesn't allow you to export from behind the meter in their programs. And so you have storage capacity that has to just sit idle because they start discharging up to the customer's load, but they can't go beyond that. This is just a ridiculous rule that just severely handicaps the ability of these resources to provide their full value. There's this kind of arcane issue called incrementality. It's basically the utility's assessment of how much of these resources that you say you can provide in response to these solicitations or these tariffs is beyond what we already forecast. Our forecast that arrived at this need where we determined that there's a shortfall already included solar. It already included storage. So how do you differentiate what you're providing as being incremental or additional to that? It's true, I'll admit, that's a tricky damn question to answer. It's hard to figure out, well, what was already in the forecast and how do we prove that what we're offering is beyond that? But there are solutions. Right now, it's just this kind of very hand-wavy solution that says, well, the utilities can determine if it was incremental or partially incremental, but no guidance about what share of the output we can provide will actually count and how that will affect our compensation. It really discourages participation because you have no idea if you submit a bid what you're going to get in exchange for that, even if you're selected. So we need to fix this incrementality issue and this no export rule to really allow these resources to do what they can and provide the value they can. Just some very high-level conclusions. I would say overall, the customer-sided market for solar, it is stable now, but those two key drivers of the value of solar for customers, the investment tax credit and NEM policy, are significant landmines that could completely blow up the market in the next 3 to 4 years. Customer-sided storage can come in and help support solar and ensure its value and future-proof it, but it's still a fairly expensive technology. The prices are coming down, but and it is dependent on subsidies. If we really don't want to decimate the solar industry, we've got to help the storage industry scale up over a comparable time frame. And as I was saying in just the last slide, we really have got to hammer out some of these major barriers that are impeding the participation of these resources that want to provide more value and often just inhibited from being able to do that. So lots of work left to be done on developing those market mechanisms to provide real grid services. All right, and that wraps it up. Thank you very much.